Hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview. I'm very pleased to be joined by Gadeir Abbas, who is an attorney. He recently wrote an article for us at Shadowproof on the terrorism watch list about how it's being internationalized and expanded, with India becoming a partner in our terrorism watch listing. So thank you for speaking to us, Gadeir.
Thanks for having me.
And so the reason why I wanted to have you on is because, and to do this interview is because after the Orlando shooting with Omar Mateen, people have been talking about expanding the terrorism watch list. So let's begin very broadly, and then we'll start to get down to specifics. What's your assessment of the conversation as you're hearing people talk about what should be done with the terrorism watch list?
It's really a nauseating conversation. As an attorney, I've represented dozens of people that are on these watch lists, probably more than 50 at this point. And generally speaking, as almost to a person, these people that are on the watch list are not charged with a crime ever. So they're innocent. And that's infuriating that the discussion is around expanding this thing called the terrorist watch list that doesn't include any actual terrorists. The watch listing system has really been a debacle from the very beginning. The government has, always maintained watch lists for one reason or another. But after George W. Bush issued an executive order in 2003, the federal government chose to consolidate all its watch listing in a single place. And what it chose to do was to set the standard for watch listing at a really, really low level, at a really unprecedentedly low level. The standard for being on the watch list is not you're currently engaged in criminal activity. No, that's not the standard. The standard is that you pose a threat of committing a terrorist act. And there's a big difference between posing a threat of doing something and actually doing something. The federal government's ability to predict the future about who among the innocent will later become a terrorist is essentially zero. And as part of a few cases, I've looked over the people that have actually committed acts of terrorism inside the United States, and I haven't found a single person that has committed an act of terrorism inside the United States that was on a watch list at the time they committed their act of terrorism. And that means that the watch list is not a terrorist watch list. It's an innocent people watch list.
And so I want to read, it's possible that you may be reacting to this quote for the first time, but there is a quote about the watch list that has gone, as the word would be, viral, with Senator Joe Manchin talking about due process. So I just want to get this full quote in here, and he's basically said, the problem we have, and really the firewall we have right now, is due process. It's all due process. So we can all say we want the same thing, but how do we get there? And he continued on. This was during an appearance on Morning Joe on MSNBC, and the meat of the quote comes here. If a person is on the terrorist watch list, like the gentleman, the shooter in Orlando, twice by the FBI, we were briefed yesterday about what happened, but that man was brought in twice. They did everything they could. The FBI did everything they were supposed to do, but there was no way to keep him on the NICS list or keep him off the gun buy list. There was no way to do that. So can't we say that if a person under suspicion, there should be a 5-year period of time that we have to see if good behavior, if this person continues the same traits, maybe we could come to that type of an agreement, but due process is what's killing us right now. I'll just let you have at it. Like, what are the...
the first thing to know is that the fact that Omar Mateen was visited by the FBI twice is completely unremarkable because the FBI maintains a network of more than 10,000 informants that saturate the Muslim community across the country. And so I've had people in my family that have been visited by the FBI. I've had people in my wife's family be visited by the FBI. I have friends that have been visited by the FBI. Everybody in the Muslim community knows someone or has themselves been visited by the FBI, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their social status. So the FBI's and this representatives thought that because the FBI visited this killer is some indication that that person is going to be a future terrorist is not indicative. I bet that with the number of visits and the number of assessments that the FBI conducts, that you're just as likely to find a terrorist that hasn't been approached by the FBI as you are to find a terrorist who has previously been approached by the FBI. And second of all, every single time there is an act of terrorism and that person is not on a watch list, no one ever asks the question, well, why didn't you watch list that person in the first place? And really what it is, it's an indictment of the watch listing system itself. The government cannot predict the future, and in fact, the many studies that have been done trying to find correlations between specific behavior, specific backgrounds, and future propensity to commit acts of terrorism have found that there really aren't any predictors of terrorism. The New York Times had, and if we do want to latch onto a predictor of terrorism, probably the best one is people that commit domestic violence. There's a New York Times article that said about 10 to 15% of all people that commit acts of terrorism have some domestic violence in their background. And so if we're going to be watch listing, let's just put all of the people that are convicted of domestic violence on the watch list. But that ultimately does not make any sense, because when you're trying to predict an extraordinarily rare event, you're unable to do so. That it's in the nature of very large numbers that you cannot predict, for instance, where lightning will strike. You cannot predict with any meaningful degree of certainty where a tornado will land. Those types of things, because of the nature of the thing that you're predicting, evade the ability of the federal government to predict the future. And so what you end up constructing is a unprecedentedly large, diabolical, really, system that accords people systematically second-class citizen status.
Now, before we go further, I just want to establish that whatever we say from this point forward, I'm not, and I'll let you speak for yourself, suggesting that what Republicans are going to be doing with the terrorism watch list is anything less than political opportunism, because the gun issue plays well with their constituents. But I do want to get into a conversation about the nature of the terrorism watch list. So I'll pause there if there's anything you want to say about what you've seen so far, given the fact that there is tremendous ignorance on both sides of the, from both major political parties when it comes to how the terrorism watch list impacts American Muslims.
Sure, and I fall into that category as well. I've been litigating these cases for about 6 years now, and when I first started litigating these cases, it occurred to me that there probably is some role for the watch list to play in national security. But after 6 years of seeing how the federal government uses the watch list, there is no role. There is no appropriate way that the federal government should have the authority to watch list people, because one, the government can't predict the future, and two, it's the most effective way of countering acts of terrorism is by investigating people and arresting them if they're terrorists.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if you have any sort of reaction to the fact that this is something the government wants to possibly use in order to enforce gun control. I mean, given the cases that you've litigated, what do you think come to mind as the problems? Peeling aside the partisan politics around whether people should have Second Amendment rights or no Second Amendment rights, or whether they should be able to have what gun and which gun. I mean, assuming that we all want to prevent the worst types of gun violence,
Yep.
What are the problems with using this terrorism watch list to enforce gun control?
Well, number one, in terms of the American citizen, the American people that would be predominantly affected if we're using the watch listing system as gun control, we're only talking about several thousand people out of a country of more than 300 million. So when we reduce gun control down to the few thousand people that are on these the few thousand Americans that are on this watch list, we're probably not accomplishing anything in a best case scenario anyways. And then the second thing is that really what's most fascinating to me is that the Republicans are just better on this issue. And they're better on this issue because they view guns as a sacrosanct right, whereas the Democrats do not view the right of innocent people to move as sacrosanct, because they understand that when we're talking about watch listing, we're really only going to be affecting the Muslim community and no one else. And so, and furthermore, the incidences of mass violence perpetrated by people with guns has not overwhelmingly been by people that are Muslim. And we know from experience that the watch lists disproportionately affect the Muslim community, and it's extraordinarily rare to find anybody on a watch list that is not Muslim.
And so, judging the record of the government, judging the stigma attached to going after non-Muslim people who are suspected of being involved in terrorism activities, what do you have as a concern for how, if this were to pass, it would disproportionately just be targeted towards Muslim communities, like just those people on the list that other people with non-Arabic sounding names would somehow be missed when enforcing?
Well, I think ultimately the people that are on the terrorist watch list understand that they're being surveilled in some capacity by the federal government. So these people aren't trying to buy guns anyways. I think there was a government report a few years ago that said that there was, 80, 90, something like that, less than 100 instances where a person on a watch list actually tried to buy a gun. And so we're not actually talking about a large number of folks. And again, one of the issues with the watch listing system is, first, you have to put the people that will be dangerous in the future on the watch list. You have to predict the future, which the government can't do. But second, you have to make sure that the point of purchase, wherever the matching between the person and the watch list is occurring, you have to make sure that that happens accurately and well. At this point, no one's talking about a watch listing application at gun shows, right? So even people that want a gun and are on a watch list could just go to a gun show, or they could buy a black market gun. That's very easy to do. I think the case of Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, really illuminates this very well. He was known to the government before he tried to detonate a bomb in Times Square, and then soon after he tried to do, but they didn't put him on a watch list. And then soon after he detonated his device, they knew it was him, and they put him on the no-fly list. He was still able to board a plane even though he was on the no-fly list, because the mechanism of distributing the no-fly list and these terrorist watch lists is clunky. And whenever you're trying to create an information system that has hundreds of thousands of entries into it that changes more than 100 times each day, you're going to have issues with disseminating that information. And so, the watch listing system fails on every level that the watch listing system is supposed to be successful. And so ultimately, this is really an exercise in futility. For some people, it's going to make some folks feel better that the so-called terror loophole, the terror gap, as people are calling it, is going to get closed. And for others, the gun lobby, they're going to be very happy that the only thing they're conceding in the gun debate is that a few thousand Muslims that are probably not trying to buy guns anyways won't be able to buy guns. And at the end of the day, in the midst of mass shooting after mass shooting, I bet the NRA lobby is happy to make this concession because ultimately it's meaningless, a form of gun control.
Well, it's remarkable to me because following the NRA, they seem to be taking the civil libertarian line for instituting due process. So I want to get into how I want to detach ourselves from the times for just a moment and talk about to add some context to our conversation before we wrap up the interview. But I do think it's important to bring in this aspect of what's happening. So FBI Director James Comey is apparently concerned about maybe bringing in this terrorism watch list and using it in the way that it would be used. Apparently, they have tools outside of using the terrorism watch list right now. They can tell when people buy guns who are suspicious, and he says that usually we would just we would be able to use those tools to go after those people. And I think that what that does is that brings in I think we should bring into the conversation, in your work on the terrorism watch list, there are very real ways that it is used in a punitive sense against people to control them or to discourage certain behaviors within communities. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the watch listing system is primarily punitive. The FBI agents that are placing people on these watch lists don't take them seriously. They understand that it's a form of CYA, cover your ass. If you end an investigation and you don't know what to do or where to go or where to take things, just throw them on a watch list. 98.96% of nominations as of 2014 get accepted. So an FBI agent makes the nomination, the Terror Screening Center essentially always accepts the nomination. And for folks that are engaged in political activity, for folks that have been engaged in relief efforts in Middle Eastern countries as a result of the Arab Spring, people that went to Libya to help with relief work or anti-Gaddafi activity, people that are working to bring relief and aid to people in Syria. Those are the folks that end up on the federal watch list. People that refuse to sit down with FBI agents without an attorney, those people end up on a watch list. And what's remarkable to me is how often it's been the case where after a substantial amount of attention gets brought to a particular case, after a lawsuit gets filed, that all of a sudden a person who spent years unable to fly or years being brutalized by secondary screening and humiliated in front of friends and family, those folks are just taken off the watch list without a moment's notice. I had a case last year where I represent a guy named Yassine Kaddoura, and he was on the no-fly list. He was born in the U.S. He went to Libya to do Arab-English translation for a lot of the journalists that were coming to cover the revolution before it was clear where it was going. He played a big part of organizing a journalism center in Benghazi. And when he came back, there was a Homeland Security agent that told him, like, look, we don't think you're a dangerous guy, but we're going to put you on this list, and you're not going to be able to fly unless you work with us. He didn't want to take their money. He didn't want to be a spy for the FBI, as is a very reasonable decision to be. And so as a result of making that choice, the FBI punished him. They put him on the no-fly list for several years. We filed suit, and after we filed suit, the government really just by an email. They didn't get any additional information about Yassin. They just took him off the no-fly list, and they took him off the no-fly list as a litigation tactic. The Congress, unfortunately, has holds, I think, next to no promise to reform this watch listing system that's run amok. All that's left is the courts, and this really is the prerogative of the courts to defend the rights of a very, very unpopular minority, Muslims, and not only Muslims, Muslims that have been accused of being terrorists by the federal government. That's probably the least popular group in America right now. And if the courts don't step in and constrain the government's watch listing authority, we are going to see people in the coming decades excluded from the federal highway system or from Amtrak as a result of this watch listing system.
So the last question, I think this is probably a good note to end on, is when you hear someone like Senator Joe Manchin say due process is what's killing us now, it's a Sisyphean task to bring due process to the terrorism watch list. People have been trying to do that for a decade plus now. And I'd like you to just talk briefly about what that has been like, because you've been doing this work to try to bring due process rights, some semblance of it, to the terrorism watch list.
Yeah, and it's been enormously frustrating. My impression of the watch list in 2010 was that it was much more reasonable than what it turned out to be. Everything that we learn about the watch list reminds us just how dumb of an idea it is, and how poorly this isn't a problem of implementation. The problem is inherent in the idea that we're going to assign a federal agency in Vienna, Virginia. We're going to assign them the authority to predict the future and to punish people based on their predictions of the future. And the passage of time has showed us that the government is terrible at predicting the future. And so this isn't about changing things on the margins. There are still, in the cases that I work on, arguments about due process and getting, process after the fact. But really, the thing that I've taken away from doing this work for 6 years now is that we don't need more due process. We need an entire end to the watch listing system. That is the goal of various cases that I'm involved with, and I think that's the only solution for the debacle of the federal terrorist watch listing system.
All right, Gadeir, I want to thank you for doing this interview with me. Everyone who wants to read his story, it is titled U.S.-India Agreement Will Greatly Expand the Terrorist Watch List. This just went up a few days ago, and it gets into the internationalization of the list, which is an issue we didn't really touch, but I thought it was important for us to touch on the current conversation, and I thank you for joining with me. So thank you, and best.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Bye.